Because Trump is not a conservative. I mean, Trump does not agree with the kind of paint-by-numbers conservatism that we're used to. Mike Pence might be, but Trump's not. That's not where he's coming from. He's expressed tons of ideas that would be considered leftist or liberal. I do not think he was a white nationalist candidate, and I do not think that Donald Trump is the alt-right. But in Cleveland, Ohio, where I was in the room, he said, I am going to be your champion. The system is rigged against you. I understand how it's rigged against you, and I am going to stick up for you. That is a profoundly different rhetoric than anything said by Mitt Romney or John McCain.
Welcome to the Jamie Weinstein Show.
I'm your host, Jamie Weinstein. Every week, I interview the biggest names in politics, business, and media to glean some of the lessons they learned on their various roads to success. I also get them to open up on the most important issues of the day. So come along with me. We'll have some fun and hopefully learn something while we're at it. Hello, everybody. Welcome to a Thanksgiving week edition of the Jamie Weinstein Show. Today's show is a little bit unusual, a little bit different. My guest is certainly much more controversial, you might say even reprehensible in terms of his ideology. You might have heard of the term alt-right. It's got a lot of attention since Donald Trump's victory. Some people say that Donald Trump, appealed to the alt-right in a certain way. He certainly has retweeted the alt-right, whether he knows he has or not. Some of his surrogates claim that they never even heard of the term, even though the alt-right is claiming victory in the aftermath of Donald Trump's success. So I sit down for this episode with Richard Spencer, the man who is widely credited with coming up with the term alt-right. Many people call him a white supremacist or a white separatist. He likes to call himself an identitarian. A lot of people think that's just euphemism. I'll let you listen to the show and decide for yourself. But we talk about a lot of different issues in this podcast. We have a very wide-ranging discussion. I press him on his views, where he wants to go with his movement, what his ultimate goals are, what exactly is his connection to Donald Trump's campaign, if any at all. And I also press him on this notion that we see in a lot of press reports about the alt-right, that they're really kind of a form of the conservative movement. Maybe they're more radical than most conservatives, but they're kind of from the same school of conservatism, which I think you'll think after listening to this podcast is just not the case. But I think you're going to find this pretty fascinating. You might find some of his views reprehensible. I certainly do. But I think it's worthwhile engaging, at least in a conversation, to understand what this term alt-right means. It's kind of a sanitized term, I think. So I reached out to Richard Spencer to see if he would sit down with me. He was actually in Washington, D.C. for a conference, an alt-right conference, which we discussed as well. But I will not editorialize more than that and let you decide what you think from the conversation itself. But before we get to the conversation, I want to remind everybody about the charitable endeavor that we are engaged in this show. I will give $10 away for each 5-star review I get on iTunes, up to 400 reviews or $4,000 through the end of November, half of which will go to the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, half of which to a charity suggested by you, the audience. So if you have not gone to jamieweinstein.com and emailed me a charity, and many people have not yet, so there's still a big opportunity out there for me to choose a charity suggested by you, the person who's listening right now, you. So go do that. Go to jamieweinstein.com and suggest a charity, half of which of the money that I give away will go to that charity. But most importantly, go to iTunes, listen to the show, enjoy the show, give us a 5-star rating, and I hopefully will get the most 5-star ratings we can, up to 400 reviews, so we can give the most amount of money away. Beyond that, go to jamieweinstein.com and interact with me. Send me questions and comments, guests that you'd like to see, or go to Twitter, Jamie_Weinstein, and tweet at me your thoughts of the show. But without further ado, let's get right to it. Richard Spencer. Richard, thanks for joining the Jamie Weinstein Show.
My pleasure. Thanks for asking me.
Let's just start with learning a little bit about your background, how you came to your views. So tell me how you grew up.
Sure. I grew up in a fairly idyllic suburban environment in Dallas, Texas. I was actually born in Boston, Massachusetts, but from the time I was a very young child. I grew up in Dallas. I went to a prep school in Dallas, Texas that was also it lived up to the moniker prep school. We wore uniforms and went to chapel, and Episcopalian chapel.
The basis of Rushmore, right?
That is true. You've done some research. Yeah, I think it was what is the director of Rushmore?
Wes Anderson.
Wes Anderson. I forgot his name. I believe he might have been expelled, and he was kind of getting back at my school a little bit through Rushmore. It was a bit of a parody. Yeah, and I remember seeing that movie when it came out and loving it for that fact. Yes, and so I that was my environment. I had a very nice childhood, loving parents and white privilege, you could say. So I don't. I think when you ask, where did you arrive at your views? I guess I could say that, in the womb. I mean, I was born with them. I don't think I've fundamentally changed. Although, some of my policy ideas have evolved. Some people, I've been influenced by people I've read. But I think if you really want to get it like a spiritual aspect to someone, it really is there from the beginning.
Were your parents, what do you want to call them, white separatists, racist,
not.
white supremacists, anything along those lines?
No. I mean, again, I don't like most of those words you just used, but
I try to give a bunch of them to give.
That's fine. No, absolutely not. I mean, I would say that they were more daily caller Republican types, much more mainstream. They were definitely not the radicals that I am, and I mean I like the word radical. That's a word I would use. Radical does not mean an extremist. An extremist is someone who takes something too far. A radical is someone who wants to really get at the root of something.
What do your parents think of what you are doing now? Do they when they go to the grocery store, or go to dinner with friends? What is your son doing? Well, he's a leader of a white separatist movement.
Right. I again don't use the term white separatist, but that's fine. Yeah, I'm a bit of a black sheep. I think they'll always love me, hopefully. I mean, look, they know that I'm not doing anything immoral. They might have preferred that I did something like banking or real estate or something that would be you could tell your friends about. But look, it is what it is, and I don't think anyone in my family is going to abandon me or something like that.
I mean, I've read that you were in high school. You were friends with the one African American student. I don't know if that's true or not in your school, but there had to be something that kind of clicked with you, that kind of changed your worldview. I mean, a lot of these stories, sometimes it's a minority that dumped you or something along those lines. Do you have any coming of age story like that?
No.
What clicked? What made this switch?
Well, keep in mind, the person in question, John, we weren't great friends. He was on the football team. I knew him, hung out. I mean, remember, there was, I think, one black person in my class. Each class seemed to have a token black student. There were definitely many number of Jews in my class. There were maybe a handful of Hispanics, not very many. So yeah, I mean, it's not like that. I think that idea of like, were you dumped by someone, or did you get mugged one time and that made you hate another race? That's definitely not the case for me. But I would say that I would be a little suspicious of someone that is motivated by such an anecdotal incident. I care about the future of Europeans and the future of our shared civilization. I'm not mad at African Americans for beating me up one time. I mean, I would be very suspicious of someone who's motivated by that. Now, of course, there are a lot of people who have experienced black crime, and that might inflect their experience. But it has to come from somewhere deeper than that. It can't come from some anecdote.
And we'll get to kind of the ideas that you kind of espouse and the terminology that you prefer that I'm using incorrectly. But it does seem that you, from what we'll discuss in a bit, is that you want kind of a separate homeland for Europeans. But there had to be a switch in a way, because I know I read in that Mother Jones trial you dated Asians at one time. They obviously wouldn't be allowed in your
10 years ago, I had an Asian girlfriend. I don't really regret. I would look, when you have some success and have some impact, people are going to look up your skirt a little bit, and I would rather they not, but. I'm not going to lie to anyone. I don't have any regrets because this is a very nice person. It is what it is. It's I think a lot of what the alt-right should be about is becoming something, becoming who we are. I mean, it's why I use this term, and I like it. And in some ways, we're not coming from an environment in which an environment of, say, white supremacy or segregation. We're not coming from an environment where, we are in charge and we're trying to maintain it. The alt-right is really coming from multiculturalism. It's coming from multiracialism. The fact that there's so many young people in it who have experienced anti-white discrimination or anti-white morality at a college or university or a corporation, that's where we're coming from. And I think it's a lot like Baron Munchausen, pulling himself out of a swamp by his own pigtail. We've got to become something. We've got to become it, through our own actions and through our own consciousness. So I would say that there are many people went on a date with an Asian girl. Who cares? It's not a big deal. The whole point is, where are you going in the future? Like, what do you want to be a part of?
I guess my question wasn't to show an inconsistency or anything like that. It was to ask, was there a turning point in your evolution that you went from, kind of looking into these ideas to kind of firmly becoming a purist in these ideas?
A purist. You use a lot of terms. I am definitely not known as a puritanical person. I'm actually very open. Just to go back to what you're saying, certainly from about from when I was an undergraduate at the University of Virginia in the turn of the century, I was becoming very interested in radical ideas. Less so when I was in high school. In high school, I was more interested in, goofing off and playing football. When I was an undergraduate, I was becoming very interested in radical ideas of the left and the right, and everywhere on that spectrum. After UVA, I started to take race seriously. Actually, Jared Taylor, who was at the conference and so on, was a very important person in that regard. I think there was an evolution that definitely happened. Maybe you could say around 2009 or 2010. I don't think there's one date that I would put that where I really became an identitarian, and that is something different than just being, say, a race realist or someone who thinks that there is a genetic basis for thinking about race. It's really saying that identity is at the heart of my thinking about politics, society, and culture. And that question, who are you, is the first question you ask.
So let me just ask you kind of generally, let's get into kind of what you believe. Sure. Perhaps I'm mischaracterizing you a bit. So what is your ideal vision for America?
Right. Let's take a step back, and I'm not dodging the question. I really think this is the best way to discuss it. A useful metaphor for me is of saying you have a street level or ground level view of reality, and then you have a view of, say, 100 feet up. You're on top of a building and you can kind of see the horizon, and then there's the view from the mountaintop where you kind of think out, where are we going to be 1,000 years from now? That view from the mountaintop is not really about America at all. It's about where I hope European people and European civilization will be in the future. And yes, I think that in terms of our great ideals, I think they should be as big and powerful and voluptuous as possible. I think we should think of ourselves as reinventing the Roman Empire, as engaging in space conquest, as being who we are in the most radical, the most dangerous way possible. So yes, I have those ideals. It's very similar to a leftist in the 19th century. They thought about communism. What would it be like to live in a truly egalitarian society? At that point, people say, "Oh, you need to be pragmatic. Monarchy is the political system of the day. You guys are thinking too big. We need to be pragmatic here." But the fact is, the fact that the left was able to dream those dreams was very important, and it gave them a kind of dynamism. It gave them a big hope that was motivating them. I think the right needs that too. The right is never going to ultimately succeed if it's only about tax cuts or limiting government or prudence or something like that. The right has to have that kind of dynamic force, that big dream that is most likely not going to be realized even in our lifetimes. And so that's when I talk about something like the ethno-state, that's what the ethno-state is. Now, let's go back to like ground level. Ground level is I'm doing this podcast with you right now. I'm talking about ideas. I'm replying to an email, doing an interview or writing a blog or something like that. And that's just like the day-to-day stuff where you apply your ideas to reality. I think we can get up like 100 feet, and that's a point between, grand Nietzschean ethno-state dreams and street level stuff. And you could say the alt-right has gone from 0 to 1. Like, we've gone from a marginal movement.
You use kind of Peter Thiel's language. Is he someone that you guys admire, or 0 to 1 was the title of his book?
Yeah, I think Peter Thiel, I do admire him, certainly, and I think Peter Thiel is an interesting person because he endorsed Trump, but he's not a conservative, clearly. And so I don't know exactly what he wants or what he thinks, but at the very least, it's a new voice that seems to have some impact. So I've never been in contact. Interesting guy. I don't know what to think about him quite yet. Yeah, I do like that 0 to 1 metaphor. That's a kind of startup metaphor. That's where the alt-right is right now. We are not. We don't have the level of institutions that the conservative movement has. We're not even close. But I think we're having a tremendous impact. If you look at our impact to funding ratio, it is off the charts. And we've got to bring those up to where they're meeting. But to go back to where I was saying before, like the alt-right has gone from 0 to 1. Now we need to go from 0 to 100. And can we see that? Can we see a point where the alt-right is impacting policy? It's impacting culture. It's impacting art. It's impacting society. I mean, the alt-right was the second place word. I think it lost to post-truthiness as the word of the year by the Oxford English Dictionary in terms of this new word that burst on the scene and was reproduced everywhere. So, we want to be, this is what we want. We want to be recognized. We want people talking about us, thinking about us, arguing with us. And so can we go from 1 to 100 in the next 5 to 10 years? Yes. I mean, that is what I want to do. And that's so that is my vision. So it's not, the ethno-state is grand and big, it's important, but it's more about being pragmatic. It's about bringing some idealism to reality.
So you say 100, the ethno-states say down the road. What is 10 years down the road? What is your goal in government?
I don't think the ethno-state's 10 years down the road, definitely. No, in terms of our goal in government, one thing that I announced at our conference was that we're going to do every 2 months, we're going to issue a new policy paper. These are policy papers that are going to be out in front. They're going to be a vanguard policy paper, but I think they're going to have at least a realistic chance of being implemented by Trump. Because Trump is connected to us on a kind of psychic or emotional level, in the sense that Trump's campaign was not about conservatism, it was about identity politics, and everyone knows that. And that is our starting point.
I'm not sure everyone knows that. I mean, why do you think that?
Okay, because Trump is not a conservative. I mean, Trump does not agree with the kind of paint by numbers conservatism that we're used to. Of you've got to be pro-capitalism, you've got to be anti-terror, you've got to be pro-life, you've got to be against greater regulation, and so on, just down the line of again, this little checklist. Mike Pence might be. But Trump's not. That's not where he's coming from. He's expressed tons of ideas that would be considered leftist or liberal.
I agree, but just because didn't run as a conservative doesn't mean that he appealed to identity.
I think he definitely appealed to identity quite explicitly, actually. I do not think he was a white nationalist candidate, and I do not think that Donald Trump is the alt-right. But in Cleveland, Ohio, where I was in the room, in the hall, he said, "I am going to be your champion. The system is rigged against you. I understand how it's rigged against you, and I am going to stick up for you." That is a profoundly different rhetoric than anything said by Mitt Romney or John McCain, which was, "I'm going to create a free market where you can fall or rise by your own efforts." This was, "I'm going to stick up for you who's voting for us." The way he talked, he showed this empathy and sympathy, just emotional connection with minors, with people in the Midwest who voted for him who would have otherwise not voted or voted for Democrats. And wasn't he saying the system is rigged by other white people in most cases against white people and other people? So it wasn't necessarily speaking, I'm going to be the champion of
I mean, I guess you could see it that way, but that wasn't necessarily what he would probably, if you asked him, he probably wouldn't say I was only speaking to white people.
No, I don't think he was only speaking to white people, but the fact is 90% of Republican votes are by white people. Why he won was that he reached a new swath of white people living in the Midwest who otherwise wouldn't have voted or voted Democratic. And so, look, and I think also, I don't think I'm saying too much by saying that I think Donald Trump assumes America is a European-derived nation. If the cast of Hamilton or your average hipster liberal, they can become in a way pro-American in the sense that America is this just purely proposition nation for the whole world to come and experience freedom and individualism. Donald Trump, and I would say most Americans have at least assumed that America is a nation derived primarily from Anglo-Protestants, but ultimately, particularly after the immigration after they came after the Civil War, it's ultimately derived from this big family of Europeans. This is a Western nation. Donald Trump, just because of his generation, maybe at the very least, assumes that.
Okay, I think my views, I think it's hard to assume what Donald Trump actually thinks about a lot of things. I don't think he's actually thought about a lot of the things. But I want to get back to Trump in a second, because I still want to stick to kind of your ideas.
Sure.
So what would your ideal form of government be, even in this kind of ethno-state 1,000 years from now? What would that government look like?
I wouldn't want to get too specific. Marx never described the ins and outs of communism. It is ultimately a dream, and I think it's a bit LARPy to start, talking about we're going to have a bureaucracy of this kind and so on. I think the main issue is really just to dream it and to think about what this would be like. I would say that I seriously doubt it would be of the mass democracy as a reality show of modern America. I don't think that's particularly healthy. I think Donald Trump has been this fascinating man, and that he's used his own celebrity. He's used all of these, he's used the media and this whole environment, which I think has been detrimental to civilization and society. And he's actually used it in a positive way. And only he could do that. But yeah, again, I don't, in terms of like an ethno-state, how would be run in order, it's not really worthwhile talking about, because it's just so far out in the future. In terms of, what I would like to see a Donald Trump administration do, I would definitely talk about that in more specifics, because I think he can do a lot.
Well, let me ask you this, though. I think a lot of the writing about you in your movement seems to suggest that, you're a derivation of the right in a way, that you're maybe a little bit more to the right than figures that we consider mainstream. Mm-hmm. But just my reading of your works and kind of listening to your podcasts, I don't see much Reagan conservatism. Let me just throw out
there's hardly any at all.
Yeah, let me throw out a few things here, and correct me where I'm wrong. You're not strong believers in the free market. You don't care that much about the Constitution.
No.
You're kind of isolationist a little bit in terms of you're not wanting to be a Pax Americana around the world. As far as I can tell, a significant portion aren't necessarily pro-life. They kind of favor abortion to kind of reduce minorities' output in society. You're communitarian more than pro-individualistic.
Yes.
I've heard that you're not necessarily against the EU. You just wish that people like you were running the EU.
Correct.
With the bureaucracy. What is necessary? Where in the modern conservative movement do you actually fit? I see no elements of the modern conservative movement.
It's the alt-right. We are not just some wing of Buckleyite, Reaganite conservatism. That's why we're exciting.
I could see you just as well as being a derivation of the left.
Sure. Look, I don't think that. I think that there is. When you care about your people and your civilization, and that comes first, I think it's really hard for you to be characterized as left wing. But if you want to say that, I'm fine with it, just in the sense that why the alt-right is special, why we're interesting, is that we are not William F. Buckley, we are not Ronald Reagan. That we've lived through that whole paradigm. I think it's a better question of are those people actually right wing? I mean, that's just as legitimate question as asking about the alt-right. You don't see this kind of pro-free market legal fetishism in the sense of worshiping the Constitution. You don't see that in other places. That is not the way we would characterize European right-wing movements. That's not the way you would characterize non-white right-wing movements.
You wouldn't characterize Burke. I mean, what you're talking about is revolutionary in a way. You want to undo the foundations. That's kind of Burkean conservatism. It is not either.
We don't want to. I mean, look. I think in the current context, I would say that there is a revolutionary character to the alt-right. Certainly,
you're comparing yourself to Marx. You're the Marx of the alt-right movement.
Glenn Beck said that, and you have to understand.
But you just kind of compared yourself without explicitly saying that. You're talking about the Communist Manifesto didn't talk about the state that he wanted afterwards. So I'm not going to do it now. You kind of compared yourself to that.
Sure. I think people can tell that my tongue is a little bit in my cheek whenever I would do something like compare myself to Marx. But I will agree with you. There is a revolutionary character to the alt-right. We do want to change society, and we want to change the world, and we are trying to break out of the current paradigm in so many ways. Paradigms that are ultimately derived by liberalism and individualism, paradigms that are only ultimately derived by a foreign policy consensus that both most Republicans and most Democrats agree with, and so on. I mean, yes, there is a way that we are breaking free from the way people have thought all of my life and actually decades before.
Right, and there are movements that seem to be derived in kind of the modern conservative movement that do that as well. Rand Paul certainly believes in a lot of things of the Reagan Revolution, but he wants to kind of move away from the foreign policy paradigm. Let me read a quote. Let me read a quote for you real quick.
Sure.
That you said in one podcast. I think the Soviet Union protected Russians from an even worse ideology. That is the liberalism of the United States and Western Europe. Mm-hmm. What you're saying is that you think that the Soviet Union communism protected their people better from what you think is a worse ideology, is which is the ideology that created the most successful economically and military power in the world, which is the United States, and freest time that we've ever been alive in Western Europe in kind of this Pax Americana.
I'm not necessarily endorsing the Soviet Union. I do not want communism. What I'm saying when I say statements like that is trying to make people start thinking seriously and critically about the world in which they live. The Soviet Union, as Jonathan Bowden put it, would attack the body, whereas liberalism rots the soul. And what I mean by that is that there were horrible terrors at the beginning of the Soviet Union and the Bolshevik era. And once Soviet communism was established, those terrors subsided. Stalinism subsided, purging subsided, and I think it kind of settled into a fairly conservative, in some ways nationalistic, and in many ways gray and boring type of world. But I think it's there's this great irony that so many people in the former Soviet bloc were protected from the rot of liberalism and multiculturalism, cultural Marxism, and so on. It's a grand irony of history that there are healthier nationalist movements in the former Soviet bloc, whether you're thinking about Russia, whether you're thinking about Hungarians, and so on, and Poles, that they are in a way healthier. This is a grand irony of history. I would say this, I think you can also kind of flip a lot of these things around as well. It's also an interesting fact that so much of the new ideas that really challenge the system are coming from the United States and France, the two proposition nations. And what I think about that are the French new, or the European New Right, which is really the French New Right, and now the alt-right in the United States. We're actually, these places that are maybe the most intensely liberal, intensely individualistic, are producing these kind of post-Enlightenment or postmodern right-wing ideologies, maybe precisely because we've experienced it at its height. So again, I'm a dialectical thinker. I think there are certain, you can, from different perspectives, you can see certain advantages and disadvantages from both sides. But what I am not is a binary thinker where I think that Russian society is inherently awful or the Soviet Union was inherently awful. No, there are certain advantages to it, tons of disadvantages, which I would also never not deny. It's just we can see these.
You do think that there's more disadvantages in the liberal West, according to that statement, than in Soviet Union communism?
Interesting question. I would have to think about it. Again, I'm not leaving. I'm not moving to Eastern Europe. I'm here, and I am an American, and I'm inflected by this world. The other thing, I would also never deny that the United States has produced a far, far more dynamic economy, and Apple and Uber and so on are coming out of the United States. They're not coming out of the Eastern Bloc. That is something to think about. At the same time, I think the United States is in a tremendous amount of peril, maybe precisely because of our conception of ourselves. I think there are good things about a liberal society. There are some even good things you could say about a Soviet society. It's just you have to look at it critically and not look at it polemically. Not get into this kind of typical conservative stuff of like better dead than red. Everything the Soviet Union ever did was inherently hostile. You have to look at things critically. But the fact is, like, we are where we are. And I would say that the fact that the alt-right really is emerging from America says something interesting.
That's an interesting question. And because you mentioned you are an American, and I don't think anyone would deny that you're not an American. But I think where I'm trying to get at is that I'm not sure your ideas are actually quintessentially like with the foundation of this country. They're kind of imported. Let me just ask you, do you consider yourself a practicing Christian? I read that you were a pagan.
I'm not a pagan. No, there's a lot of aspects of paganism that I like, but I'm not a practicing pagan. I don't even know how I could do that, to be honest.
Are you a practicing Christian?
I'm not a practicing Christian. I would say that I'm a cultural Christian. And so I feel at home when I attend an Episcopalian church. I felt at home when I've attended an Orthodox church as well. So I'm a cultural Christian. That resonates with me. But I'll just be perfectly honest. I'm not a believer.
Let me ask you this. Speaking just to the right, the conservative movement, what is this coalition, can you imagine, that you bring together? As you know, because you kind of, studied the conservative coalition. Famously, there's three stools. You got the foreign policy stool, you got the religious right, and you got the economic conservatives. I think you would admit you appeal to none of those in terms of what your views are. You're not an economic conservative. You're not a social religious conservative, and you're not a foreign policy conservative, as we know and understood by Reagan. What is this? How do you appeal to any of these branches? How do you build a coalition to get anything that you envision done?
I feel like you haven't recognized what just happened. Donald Trump was also not an economic conservative. He was clearly not a foreign policy.
He tried to appeal to them.
Did he try to appeal to foreign policy conservatives by brutally making fun of the Bush family in a South Carolina debate and basically announcing that conservative foreign policy was a disaster?
I would say it was a mix in a way. He made fun of the Bush family, which seems to be a pastime, I think you would admit, of Donald Trump. He enjoys making fun of the Bush family.
And the alt-right. Yeah, and me, myself,
but he also at the same time wanted to bomb the hell out of ISIS. And did a lot. It kind of talked on both sides. I do agree that he was more of a Rand Paulian in the general what he was speaking, but he kind of confused a lot of people by also talking tough. But he did appeal to the religious right. He did, promise tax cuts.
He did, but look, I don't think many people would believe that Donald Trump is a true believing Christian. I think they might describe him in a way like me. I think he's a cultural Christian. I don't think many people really believe that Donald Trump is pro-life. I think that people believe that Donald Trump would bring a realistic vision to foreign policy.
But he felt it necessary to promise those things, to say those things. He must have felt that in order to build this coalition, he had to do it.
I've heard the three stools of the conservative coalition all over my whole life. I think that those people were actually delusional. The fact that 80% of evangelical Christians, we believe exit polls, voted for Donald Trump says something. And that is that when you look at the origins of the religious right, it was a political movement first. It was we have all these people. Let's unify them around something. They in a way arbitrarily chose abortion and values and so on. And it was a political movement. I think in a way calling yourself evangelical and being evangelical is now a cultural phenomenon. And I think those people see Donald Trump as maybe not one of them, but as someone who could protect them. And so I think that is a positive thing. I think conservatives are totally delusional when they think that all of these white people who vote for them really love these terrible wars, really love free market capitalism or globalism or so on, or are really that concerned about a lot of these hot button issues. There are definitely constituencies that are totally genuine, pro-life all the way, very highly religious, and so on. And that is great, and I respect them. But the mass of white people, do they really believe in conservative ideology? Donald Trump has proven that the answer is no. It was a culture all the time. When people talk about, getting tough, supporting the troops, when people talk about a culture of life, what they were really talking about is implicit whiteness. They were talking about us. Donald Trump has revealed this to the world.
Let me ask you, I was going to get to this in a bit. How many, you had a conference in Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
We're speaking Monday, but it was over the weekend. How many people showed up to the conference?
We were pushing 300. We had about 275. I don't know the exact number because there are lots of registers the last minute.
I looked this up earlier. The idea is that you're expressing that the alt-right was this was a coming out moment for the alt-right. Mm-hmm. This July, BronyCon had 7,609 attendees. These, I don't know, for the listeners.
That was probably free, though.
For the listeners who don't know what brony is, I don't know. You might.
I do know what a brony is.
A brony is a grown man who dresses up. I was a big fan of My Little Pony and dresses up like that.
Mm-hmm. How many of those people attended my conference? That's an interesting question.
That's an interesting question. But you had, many multiples of the people that were willing to come out and basically show themselves as dressing up as My Little Ponies, grown men, then came out to the alt-right. How is this a success?
This shows the power. I think that is a fascinating comparison, and I'm going to flip it around on you. This shows the power of taboo. The fact that people are more willing to say that I am a ridiculous pervert who dresses up like My Little Pony, and they're more willing to say that than they are willing to say I care about my people and I'm a white man. That shows the power of taboo.
But let me push back.
Okay.
This Donald Trump was supposed to be kind of this victory for you. It showed that, we're here, we're strong. Look at what and you still, even in the aftermath of this great victory, can get 250, 275 people to show up at a conference.
Keep in mind, that's fine. Keep in mind one thing. This is a fairly expensive conference. One of the reasons that we have to use public facilities, private facilities will cancel on us. So it is a fairly expensive conference. It's also a very heady conference. It's not like we're having a big, BronyCon. I don't even know. I don't want to know what they're doing in there. I assume it's a little bit less intellectually demanding. This is a conference with speakers and panels and ideas. So it doesn't surprise me at all. I mean, it's what we do at an MPI conference is it's going to get an elite of the alt-right, and that's what we're searching for. That's what we're trying to do. Millions upon millions of people are not going to listen to my podcast or read my writings. That's not how it works. I'm reminded of Irving Kristol. They said, how many people subscribe to Commentary Magazine? And he was like, oh, I don't know, a few thousand. It doesn't matter. They're the right people who subscribe to Commentary Magazine. That's how influence works. We could hold a rock concert and get that many people, but we're holding an intellectual event because that's what we want to do. We want to have an impact in that sphere.
I'm going to get back a little bit to we kind of went away from kind of still discussing the ideas and support. Who counts as white?
Look, I think once you get into the weeds of this, I think it can get fairly painful and it's not really worthwhile splitting hairs. I would say that a white person when you see one. This is someone whose worldview derives from Europe. It's someone whose family is part of that extended family of Europeans. That would, of course, that would include Irish, Germans, Italians, Scots.
As you know,
Russians.
Irish weren't considered white in some parts at some time in this country. Italians weren't considered white. I read that you considered George Ramos would count as white for you, but not George Lopez.
I thought that was a little bit funny when they quoted that. They were kind of pressing me on these Hispanic things. I actually met Jorge Please pronounce his name correctly. I met, it's funny, I guess it's George Ramos, but Jorge Ramos. Or George Lopez, but Jorge Ramos.
In the ethno-state, it'll be George Ramos.
Perhaps. Maybe not. We Spaniards are obviously European. I did find that, I was a little bit surprised that they quoted that. They were kind of pressing me on this issue, and George Lopez he would identify as a Latino. Jorge Ramos, whom I met, seemed to have very little mestizo blood at all. Although he would never want to take part in the ethno-state. Let's get at this. Look, I don't want to talk, everything's a spectrum, right? Like a color is a spectrum. There's red and yellow and orange. And you could say, where does red end and orange begin, or where does orange end and yellow begin? But the fact is, there are some questionable cases, but those colors have meaning. Redness, it when you see it, it has meaning.
Does it have meaning?
You have to be derived from Europe. It's spiritually, and you have to be part of that extended family.
Now you're talking ephemeral in a way, like spirit.
No,
I mean,
it's ephemeral.
When you mention
that's the deepest, most important thing you can imagine.
But let me ask you, and you can answer and explain to me. When you say that, you European ideology, if you have you can tell someone who's white. As you know, in Europe, there are great differences between within the European countries.
Yes.
People think they're better or worse. There's this idea of this grand European, soul that is yearning to come together, is not well seen within Europe itself.
I agree and disagree with you. I would certainly never deny that ethnic nationalism it plays a huge part. I would say it is on the whole, detrimental aspect to European society. I think in a way that kind of the ethnic rivalry and nationalism you can think of as competition and dynamic and making people strive to be something higher. We don't have the luxury to be at war with one another at this point, because we are now in a global environment where we are fighting for our survival vis-a-vis, more than 1 billion Chinese, vis-a-vis the threat of terrorism coming out of the Middle East and so on. We do not have the luxury of...
Who's fighting for survival against 1 billion Chinese?
Everyone's fighting for survival again. Well, look, the billions of Chinese people are not conquering the United States. But, yes, geopolitics, life itself, it's inherently a struggle. You're in a struggle whether you want to be or not.
The Chinese right now?
Of course, there's struggles with the Chinese right now. That doesn't mean that we're literally at each other's throats. But yes,
maybe in the South China Sea. But in terms of, do you believe
there's
that it's
always a struggle for power and influence?
Do you believe it's a zero-sum game?
No, I don't believe anything's a zero-sum game.
The Chinese gain and we lose, or we gain and they lose.
Sometimes some things there's some things that you could say are zero-sum, but generally speaking, no. I think that we can live and let live, but that doesn't mean it's not a struggle. Prussia can exist and so can Russia, but that doesn't mean that you don't need an army guarding your border. What I'm arguing really against is some kind of liberalism that we can all just exist as individuals and we'll just all trade with each other in this kind of consensual way. Absolutely not. No. There are going to be struggles between peoples and territories. Whether you like it or not, there is going to be a struggle between peoples for territory. So we have to recognize that fact. There are going to be enemies in the world.
I agree with the idea that there are enemies in the world. I just don't see necessarily...
to go back in terms of ethnicity, yeah. Look, there are some very terrible things that have gone on. If you look at Ukrainianism, that is an expression of a violent, rather disgusting ideology that's anti-Russian and anti-German and ethnic supremacy. I don't really have much admiration for that at all. Scottish nationalism is a kind of softer, gentler version of this. The Scottish Nationalist Party apparently is pro-immigration. So they're kind of like a magic dirt philosophy that they just want independence from the English, but anyone can come to Scotland and be Scottish. Ethno-nationalism is not really going anywhere. And I think generally speaking, we Europeans are coming together. That doesn't mean that we'll ever get to a point where there aren't rivalries between French and Italians or Italians and Germans and so on. But I think we are coming together in the sense that we see ourselves as part of a family. The idea that
you're talking we.
French,
when you say we, it's a very.
Do you think
275 people at your conference?
Yeah, I mean, look, you could say that really about any political movement. I mean, no political conference right now has 1 million attendees.
Certainly more. But let me put a finer point on it.
Okay.
Do you think that most people in America, when they use the term "we," they see them tied to French people or Southern Italian people, or I mean, you're using "we" to encompass a lot of people who most certainly wouldn't use the term "we" to describe
in
themselves.
the United States, when people say terms like the American people or us, are you going to stick up for us? Yes, I do think that they, whether they know it or not, they are assuming white people. Yes. And that includes many different Europeans who immigrated here over the centuries. So, yes, when you hear a conservative talk about the American public, I do not think they are thinking in terms of an Indian immigrant or a Mexican immigrant. I think they are ultimately, whether they are willing to admit it or not, they are talking about white people like them. Yes.
Let's agree to disagree on that one.
Sure.
Let me go to a few other questions. I have a lot of questions, actually, but on this kind of train of thought. You are a nonviolent kind of form of I know you don't like white separatists or anything along those lines.
Well, look, I don't like white separatists because it's like, look, I am living in this world right now. What I want is consciousness. If white people are going to survive in a coming multicultural and multiracial environment, which is baked in the cake, this is where we're going right now. It's really about consciousness. Like, we need to have a sense of ourselves if we're going to survive this.
I just want to try to pinpoint down kind of some ideology through some historical examples. Would you condemn the lynchings of the KKK?
Yeah, I mean, look, I condemn violence. We're not going to engage in violence. Yeah. Yes, the KKK was not the only people lynching. That was happening all over the place.
They were morally despicable.
The KKK.
Yeah.
I'm really not gonna play this game where you ask me to condemn someone.
It sounds like you can't say it. Why can't you say the KKK was?
It's an historically. Look, the KKK. Half of the legislatures in the Indiana Congress were KKK members. I mean, this was a Americanist movement. We're talking about the second Klan and not the fat guys screaming on Jerry Springer. It's an historical movement. I'm not really like, if you just want to go down like the horrors of history and ask me to condemn something, I could do that to you.
Please, I'm trying to delve.
Do you condemn Israeli terrorists?
Sure. But Goldberg, who killed many Palestinians, I absolutely condemn Israeli terrorists.
Okay.
Who wouldn't?
Do you support Israel?
And I don't know many who wouldn't. Of course I do. But and when you have me on your podcast, you can ask me these questions. Okay. Do you condemn the Holocaust?
I am just going to give you one answer to all of these things. I hope that we can live in a nonviolent world. I have never instigated or been involved or even been accused of instigating violence. So, like, I don't want to go down some list asking to condemn me. I'm not going to play the game.
I guess I'm getting to a point then, and I think we kind of arrived at it, is that I kind of see you like, excuse this comparison for a second, the Muslim Brotherhood, in the sense that they believe dawah, nonviolent preaching, is the way to achieve their ends. That's the only thing that differentiates themselves from some of their violent groups that have the same ideology. You oppose violence as a strategy, it sounds like, not as a moral principle.
Look, I do oppose violence as a moral principle, but I'm not a delusional Pollyanna who is going to think that there hasn't been a tremendous amount of violence in history and that there isn't a time and a place in which you can use violence.
So was the Holocaust a time and a place?
No, I do not. No. Look, I'm not. No. Like,
what?
Of course, that was a terrible event. I mean, but that's the easiest thing in the world to say. I do, to be honest, I do find this a bit stupid. You're just asking me to condemn historical horrors.
Well, you were
like,
just,
do you want to condemn the wars of religion in Europe? I mean,
you were just at a conference where the reports were the people in the audience were giving, and there was pictures of the Nazi salute and things like that. I think it's legitimate to ask you whether you think the Holocaust was actually a terrible event when the reports of the
terrible things were done to many different people during that terrible war.
Was Hitler
terrible
evil?
Things? There was some Hitler. I mean, this an historical figure. He's done things that I think are despicable. It's just like I don't want to. I'm not going to play this game.
What was his most despicable things?
Look, I'm really not going to play this game. Like this is you're daring me to condemn people or begging me to condemn people. This is just not.
That's a question, but we can move on.
Look, we could go. Do you know how? I mean, do you think Emperor Constantine was despicable? I mean, he used violence in ways that I can't justify or support. I mean, there are obvious. I mean, this is just not a useful way of talking about things, and you don't do this to other people. Like in terms of like people, there's a picture.
I don't interview many people who have conferences where people are doing the Nazi salute, so I would ask that of anybody.
Look, in terms of like, I saw a picture of Tila Tequila Zig Heiling on Twitter. I got banned from Twitter, but I can still look at some of these things. Okay, good. I clearly things like that are highly ironic, and you need to take it in the spirit of when it's it's given. It's given in a sense of irony and exuberance and a bit of cheekiness, and it's like that's where it's coming from. I think at some level as well, like whenever you talk about our ideals. You'll be called the KKK. You'll be called Nazis and so on. I think in some ways these people are spitting that back in their face.
You were reluctant. I mean, let's move on. But the fact that there was reluctance to criticize them and trying to kind of come up with ways to go around them seems like makes the questions worthwhile. We're trying to delve that ideology here, but I understand you don't really want to go there. So let's move on to other questions. You say the alt-right has kind of all the ideas on the right side of the spectrum. We can debate whether it's really the right side of the spectrum. What exactly ideas are we talking about? From what I can tell, the biggest idea is this ethno-state. What are these great ideas that everyone's missing?
I don't think the biggest idea is the ethno-state. I think one can be alt-right and not necessarily believe in an ethno-state. An ethno-state is something I've talked about, and I think it is a productive ideal to think about for the far future, but you can definitely be alt-right and not even know about the ethno-state. In terms of the big ideas, I think to understand the alt-right, to go back to what I was saying earlier, you have to understand where it's coming from, and it's coming from identity. It has a new starting point. If you look at the history of the conservative movement, like looking at the Sharon Statement that was sponsored by William F. Buckley, they say they have eternal values, but they are coming from capitalism versus socialism, America versus Soviet communism. That was their starting point. They might have assumed, but they never explicated what is America as a people, what is it as a nation. And we want to do that. We have to explicate that now. Conservatism has failed because it never asked that question.
They did, though. I mean, they believe in Western, so they believe Western civilization is universal. You're saying it's an identity of people. But I guess my question still is, I mean, I've heard in many podcasts you say all the ideas, this is where we are the alt-right. We have the ideas, kind of the regular conservatives, all they want to do is cut taxes, have economic plans.
Right.
Well, to govern, you have to actually have plans. What are these ideas that are so great that I can't find?
That's a very good question, and I think one of my challenges for the coming year is to start talking about pragmatic ideas that could realistically be implemented. Even if they are vanguard ideas, they actually are in the realm of possibilities now. The alt-right has already, and I would say this, the alt-right writ large has already, even that includes people who never use that term, has already engaged in a tremendous amount of great cultural and social criticism. I mean, I would point to the European New Right, which is ongoing. I would point to someone like Sam Francis. We published a recent book called Leviathan, a huge tome of analysis. I would point to all the things that we've done in that sphere. I agree, though. I think a new challenge for us is to start thinking about more pragmatic ideas that can realistically be implemented. We actually recently issued a paper called Beyond NATO, and that was inspired in part by the fact that Donald Trump seems to have really good instincts on NATO. He recognizes that is a totally outmoded form and that we need to get beyond it. But he wasn't really able to articulate how to do that. We gave an analysis of why NATO is stuck in the past. It's about it's about effectively keeping the Russians out of Europe, the Americans in, and keeping Germany down. None of those things are really pressing concerns. The major geopolitical pressing concerns now are fundamentally mass migration of non-European people and terrorism. And those are the kind of things we need to look into. NATO just can't deal with those. NATO is very good at battling the Soviet Union. It's not good at all in these kinds of things. So we want to get beyond NATO. In terms of immigration restriction, we have this Ellis Island myth of the United States that we're all immigrants, we came here to pursue individualism or religious freedom or something like that. The fact is, we became a nation, and we have, just as there is a tradition of immigration, which I would not deny, there's also a tradition of immigration restriction. The first immigration law in 1790 restricted immigration to free white people. In terms of 1924 to 1965, that was an era of effectively net neutral immigration, sometimes net negative immigration. That also coincided with probably the greatest advances in American identity and even American world power. We want to put forth the idea of no net immigration for a 50-year period. Mass immigration has brought division, it's brought fragmentation. Why don't we try to become a nation again? That is something that is out and front, but that's something that can be realistically implemented. And I'll actually just throw this out there. We don't have anything scheduled quite yet, so this is just, I'm kind of letting you in on stuff that I'm thinking about. We are seriously thinking about doing something in early winter where we talk about environmental policy, and I think something that would be natural policy. One of the great things about America is our system of wilderness areas, state parks, and national parks. A lot of those were produced by produced by men who you could maybe call alt-right. Theodore Roosevelt, Madison Grant, Lothrop Stoddard. I have a dream of a new era of environmental protection. That is a new era of great parks, a new era of wilderness areas, and I think that would actually go right in line with immigration restriction. These are the kind of things. I mean, look, you can say, oh, what do you bring to the table? These are ideas in terms of foreign policy, immigration policy, and natural conservation. These are ideas that conservatives don't talk about. They're not thinking about it. We actually do bring these things to the table, and we can bring them we can bring them in a way that, yes, they are radical, but they can be implemented.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we made an exclusive here about the environmental proposals that might be forthcoming.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I want to continue on. We mentioned a little bit Trump earlier. I had heard that you almost hope that Trump lost because it might even be better for your cause. Well,
okay. Look, I wanted Trump to win, and I think it would have been better. I have thought the thought maybe. Conceivably, it would have been better with Hillary. It would have kind of polarized things. I don't agree with that. But I would say this, even if Trump won, I think the alt-right would have risen. I'm sorry, misspoke there. Even if Trump lost on November 8th, I think the alt-right would have continued to rise. It's something said can't be unsaid. He opened up a new space for us. But the fact that he's won, I think, is amazing. And I think also what we're seeing just right now is this, he is in a way accelerating a kind of division of the country, because after he won, we don't have liberals saying, oh, well, I guess he won fair and square, he's our president now. You have mass protest saying, not my president. You have this ongoing culture war where, the cast of Hamilton insults Trump and Pence, to their face. So, he's, in terms of increasing identity politics, this is happening. This is something that, win or lose is happening. Yeah.
You mentioned you were at the Republican convention in the state. How'd you get in? Were you was someone with the campaign or someone give you tickets?
Wow, I can't tell.
So it seems. So I guess my question is, who's your closest contact in the Trump world, in the Trump campaign, in the Trump universe?
We don't have any contact with the Trump campaign.
So do you have contact with former members of the campaign, donors, anything that got you in there?
Well, look, if I told you, I'd have to kill you.
Uh-oh.
Well, no, I mean that as a joke.
Now the violence is coming
No,
back.
yes, I shouldn't have said. No, look, I'm obviously not going to talk about anything like that.
You were friends with Stephen Miller in college. He denied it in that you were in grad school. He
was an undergraduate.
He was undergrad.
Yeah.
You hosted forums with him. He supposedly got you helping some funding for forums.
Yeah.
He denied it, but tell me about this relationship. Stephen Miller, by the way, for those who are listening, is a senior policy advisor to Donald Trump. Is a young guy, 30, 31.
Yeah. Yes, we actually hosted Peter Brimelow at Duke in 2000. I think it was the spring of 2007. Yes, Stephen Miller and I are not deep friends. I did not. Josh Harkinson did a ridiculous amount of research on me. He was talking to everyone, and so he actually brought that news to me. I was prepared not to talk about it because I thought it might harm Stephen and it might harm Trump. I have not talked to Stephen for years. We were not the best of friends, but we did work together, and I generally liked Stephen. I haven't seen him. I presume I still like Stephen. He's a very competent person. I'm glad he's working. He worked for Sessions. I'm glad he's working for Trump.
So, but it's fair to say that even if it's not Stephen Miller, you have connections within the Trump orbit that can get you into high-profile events like the Republican National Convention.
Well, I think that we don't have in any way really any direct line with the Trump campaign or anything like that. I just think because I'm smart and interesting, people gravitate towards me. They want to talk to me. I'm on your podcast right now. I know people. I network.
And obviously Steve Bannon, who's now campaign CEO, wasn't at the time of the convention.
Yeah.
He's said that the Breitbart is the platform for the alt-right.
Yeah.
Do you know Steve Bannon in any way? What is your interaction?
I was in the same room with him at Milo's party. I've never really spoken with him in some serious way. I don't know him in any serious way.
Did he know who you were?
I presume he knows who I am. Steve Bannon is not the alt-right. I think there is some common ground there, and I think Steve Bannon, like Trump, is a fighter. He is not a cuck. The fact that he said that Breitbart could be a platform for the alt-right, I think that was actually a pretty good description in the sense of Breitbart doesn't. I'm not sure what Breitbart's ideology is, to be honest, but I don't think Breitbart is really a thought leader in terms of the alt-right. But is Breitbart a place where some alt-right ideas are discussed, where there's some common ground that a lot of alt-right people will share Breitbart news stories? Sure. So I think that's fine. That doesn't mean that he is alt-right or that Breitbart is. I would also say there's some indications that Bannon is at the very least kind of open to these ideas. At that speech he gave via Skype in the Vatican, of all places, he seemed to indicate he knew who Julius Evola was. He talked. I think he was referencing Alexander Dugin, and he said, "Oh, maybe we have something to learn from
Alexander Dugin." For those who don't know, is kind of like the intellectual force of the Putin movement in Russia. Is that correct?
I think we in the West have dramatically overestimated his impact on Putin. He is a Russian philosopher who is and also a geopolitical thinker. But just to go back, the fact that he would even reference these people, I think, shows more of a ideological openness, and I think that's a very good thing. I can't imagine someone from the Heritage Foundation referencing Nietzsche or Evola or Dugin.
Who do you think's influence? Who do you think's introducing these writers to him?
I don't know. I think he might just, go to the internet.
Yeah.
I mean, the one thing I would say about Donald Trump is that, I didn't really like the whole the birth certificate question thing. I thought that was rather dumb, to be honest. But it also showed something about Donald Trump, that he's willing to go there. He's willing to look at the very least, taboo ideas. And that gives me some hope that he's not just going to be this suffocating, rigid, normal Republican, that he's willing to think outside the box.
What do you make that his daughter and son-in-law are Orthodox Jews?
That's interesting. Yes. Something to think about.
Is it kind of a downer for your goals that he has influences that are probably not going to push him in an alt-right direction?
Look, it's just something to think about. I've never said that Donald Trump is alt-right. I've said that he's the first step towards identity politics. But if you actually listen to what Donald Trump says and does, I think he would treat the state of Israel in a much more realistic way, maybe despite Kushner and so on. Donald Trump,
is that a big issue for you?
It's not a defining. Israel is not a defining issue. I do think it is an issue in which we clearly take a different position than the conservative movement.
Well,
and
so
most
far
liberals.
It's hard to find many issues where you stand with the conservative movement.
It's the alt-right. It's not the conservative movement. Look, in terms of the state of Israel, I think Donald Trump showed what he said in the sense of I'm going to be even-handed when I go to Israel. The idea of achieving peace between Israel and the Palestinians, that might be the toughest deal possible, but I want to try it. That in a way, is the most realistic, down-to-earth thing anyone ever said. But in another way, it's the most radical thing as anyone has ever said, because you do have these strong constituencies in the American right that are Christian Zionists. These people who seem to love, they're Gentiles. They seem to love Israel more than America or care about it more than Europe. Sometimes they seem to hate Europe.
Which is why when you say we about your ideas, it seems to be completely off base, because as you're mentioning, there's a lot of people in America, white Gentiles. Most of them probably feel more connection to the state of Israel than they do to Moldova.
That's in a way very sad, because the state of Israel is not a European place.
But I'm just saying, when you use term "we," it seems like you're using it a royal we for a lot of people that
a royal we
that are less than much less than you speak for.
I think the Christian Zionist movement is just a profoundly strange and distasteful movement. I don't want to have anything to do with them. In terms of average evangelicals, the fact that they're supporting Donald Trump, the fact that they resonate with America first. When he says that, that's always an applause line. That gives me a lot of hope. I've been someone who's been critical of evangelical Christians, but the fact that they back Trump makes me think that, I might kind of disagree with them here and there. I might not always like what they do, but they're on board, and I'm part of them, and they're part of me. So I think that's a good thing.
Do you have any contacts on Capitol Hill? Any congressmen that you are in contact with? I'm
really, in terms of something like that, I'm not going to talk about that. I mean, in terms of a personal connection, I won't talk about it.
Who's the richest?
Maybe I should just say some funny things like I just ate lunch with George Soros, or Chuck Schumer called and he said, "Oh, Richard, you're doing a great job."
Well, George Soros, actually, we interviewed Grover Norquist. He went to one of the Wednesday meetings before. Who are the richest white nationalists? Your biggest donors?
There's absolutely no way I'm going to talk about this.
Well, I just got to give it a shot to see if you would be open on that. Let me ask you this: you lived in Whitefish, Montana. I understand that you left there now and live in Arlington, or maybe you go back and forth.
I do still spend some time in Whitefish, but the move is to be closer to Washington.
So it's a almost 100%, close 95% white enclave. You've been banned from restaurants. You've been kicked out of a club of some sort. This is not very good prospects for your white ethno state, that even in lily white Whitefish, Montana, it seems like you're somewhat of a pariah.
I think I was a pariah for a few months. Basically that was coming after the Budapest experience, where I was jailed actually for trying to hold a conference, and there's this horrible obese lunatic named Randy Schuneman, who I had the displeasure of being on the same chairlift with.
He's for the listener, he's a lobbyist, foreign policy lobbyist.
From what I understand, I think he's unemployed at the moment. He's
I don't follow his career prospects.
Well, I don't think anyone does. Yeah, but anyway, I had the distinct displeasure of being on a chairlift with him, and I just made fun of him to his face. And he, acted like a little girl and went screaming to everyone, and went to the paper and went to some of his friends in Washington. Whatever. I don't regret it. But yeah, there was a little. I was in the. It's very funny because I've been in tons of papers. I've been in the New York Times. Been everywhere. But when I was in the little paper in Whitefish, that's when the town freaked out. I think it was kind of like, oh, it's real now. And So yeah, they talked about having a no hate ordinance and so on. I stood up for myself. I stood up for myself in the town hall, and they basically backed down. There's no attempt to kick me out. There's certainly some people who don't.
Right, that were.
There was actually no restaurants. I think there was one time a coffee shop. There's some girl, a blue-haired girl at a coffee shop who didn't want to serve me. Just stuff like that. Look, it's not a big deal, and it doesn't happen anymore. This is what I would say. I think what you're implying is, oh, but white people hate you, so how could you want to have a white ethnicity? I think you're misunderstanding it. Like in many ways, we have a white problem. And I've said this many times, actually, at a speech and some other podcasts. Like, before we have, say, a black problem or an Hispanic problem or a Jewish problem, Israel problem, and so on, we have a white problem. And we are trying to reform white people, first and foremost. It is white people are the major obstacle, in a way, towards the kind of change that I want to implement. The alt-right is about changing the consciousness of white people, changing how they think about the world. So it doesn't surprise me at all, and it's no contradiction that you would have this puritanical witch hunt in an all-white community. It makes a ton of sense.
Is there any allies in the mainstream conservative movement that you look to? Ann Coulter, Pat Buchanan?
Sure. I mean, look, I've always liked Pat Buchanan. I've always respected Pat Buchanan immensely. Ann Coulter is someone that I've had very mixed feelings on. During the W era, she was a kind of like extreme version of the George Bush terror warrior, and so at that point I was very anti Ann Coulter. This idea of let's bomb Muslim nations and convert them to Christianity and so on. It's not what I want to do. However,
both the bombing and the converting.
I don't want to convert Muslims to Christianity, and but look, the alt right doesn't want to bomb them either. You should give us more cred for that. We're a peaceful movement, but in terms of Ann, Ann Coulter has also written a book that was effectively Democrats are the real racist. It's called Mugged, and there's some good things in there. I think a lot of her conclusions were very off base. So I was never an Ann Coulter fanboy, but I think she's really focused. She's obviously been pro-Trump. She's really focused on immigration, and she's said things that are alt-rightish. Like, it's, the question really is, are we going to survive as a people and a civilization? We can talk about tax cuts later, so on. She's actually even said some things that lead me to believe that she is not an Israel firster, that she really is an America firster. And so, Ann Coulter is kind of alt-rightish, and I think that's a good thing. So I like her now. I'm willing to.
So you
give
see
her
her
a
as
chance.
kind of an ally of the alt-right, or a member of the alt-right in a way?
I'm not sure a member. I mean, an ally is probably a good word, or, friend, or, something like that. I don't think she is alt-right, but, is she someone that we look to and like? Sure. And Pat Buchanan is a lot deeper than Ann Coulter. I mean, Pat Buchanan's books on history, his recent book on the Nixon administration, but definitely his book on the Second World War. This is someone who's just a much deeper person.
Let me ask you, I mean, the idea of the ethno-state, 1,000 years we'll have an ethno-state. People like me and others should leave the country. Why don't you just be like
it's not necessarily going to take place here. It could take place on the moon.
Well, I guess my question is, why don't you just be like John Galt and find like a little area, create your own little world, and see how it goes?
Some extreme version of white flight. No, I don't think that's led anywhere good. I think we should engage with the world, and I think also we should present ourselves as people worthy of ruling. I think we are the type of people who can govern a society. We are the type of people who have a vision for a future, a long-term vision, not just this short-term vision of politicians. We are people who want to protect Europeans, protect our culture, protect our heritage. That's how we should present ourselves, not people who want to run away from anything.
Can you point to any great, I say white supremacists, you would say identitarian, comedians, actors, singers, entertainers that are on the scene right now?
That's a very interesting thing. You have someone like Sam Hyde, who's kind of coming into his own. He's not necessarily me ideologically, but I think there is a kind of an alt-right quality to a lot of what he's doing. If not ideology, I mean, I've never met him or anything, but in terms, there is this kind of mischievous, funny, alt-rightish quality. Someone like Ramsey Paul, who is more ideologically on my wavelength, is a very interesting YouTube comedian. I mean, look, we're coming again, as I've said, we're going from 0 to 1. Like we're coming from from being a very small movement. And what's fascinating is that we are developing more artists. We are developing more thinkers, more commentators, more even comedians. If you look back at the impact of different ideologies, conservatives or at least Republicans in many ways won elections in the 60s and 70s. The left really won the culture. The left won music. The left won rock and roll. The left won art. We want to do that. I think that the impact that the alt-right can have culturally is actually an order of magnitude the impact it could have in electoral politics. I mean, at some point, like, who cares who's the governor of Minnesota if the alt-right can inflect a great comedian?
I guess my point is, in a way, if you were to create, I know this is a long-term project, an ethno-state today, and anyone who wanted to come, who wanted to identify with you, it would be a pretty talentless society, would it not? I mean, you're not going to have great culture and art and thinkers. I mean, this is going to be.
Why would you say that?
Because I'm asking you, who you named one Sam Hyde as your one person you would hope to come there that would be of any note and of any significance.
I mean, with all due respect, that's just a very odd thing. I mean, you're like, what is European history bereft of culture and genius?
No, I think
not everyone has to be ideological. I mean, we don't need to convince everyone. I think artists should probably not be terribly polemical or dogmatic. I mean, Beethoven, wrote a symphony for Napoleon and so on, but Beethoven is not someone who is pedantically talking about politics. That's why he's great. Shakespeare showed the great tragedy of politics.
I guess
that's what I want. I don't want an alt-right artist who is going to be pedantic. I want to obviously influence culture in an ideological way, but in terms of what Europeans can produce, there's no limit. I mean, I hope to live in a world where there's another Beethoven.
Yeah, but these
Beethoven
Europeans that you refer to now, we're calling white Americans and white, they don't identify you. They don't want anything to do with you. Most of these great.
We're a heretical movement. I mean, it's like you're putting me on a pedestal to knock me off. I mean, we are a heretical movement that is going against some of the big taboos and big dogmas of the current year. And you're expecting, like, why doesn't Bon Jovi endorse the alt-right? I mean, it's just, it doesn't make sense.
I guess my question is, I mean, let's read some quotes. To be white is to be a creator, an explorer, a conqueror. Yeah. You said at your conference over the weekend, we are children of the sun.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, where are these children of where are these great figures that your
they
conference is creators?
They don't need to be ideological alt-rightist. I'm talking about the history of our people. There can be an African American, say, political leftist. Do you really question, like, his ability to say, our people, we produce Miles Davis, we produce Martin Luther King? That doesn't mean that both of those figures agree with him on everything. He's just proud of who he is. It's very simple.
Let me ask you this, and I would only raise this because these are your quotes here.
Yeah.
You lived with your parents in Whitefish, right?
No.
That's not true.
No one said that.
Was that your house, your parents' house? That's what I've read.
What do you know? I have my own property in Montana.
Okay. I was wondering, I guess when I hear quotes like a creator, explorer, a conqueror, children of the sun, I would imagine people associated with you would produce something of greatness, or even, these wealthy donors that you won't speak of, or be associated with, if they're such explorers and strong-willed figures, that they would come out and stand on their beliefs.
This is a classic example of putting me on a pedestal to knock me off it. I'm sorry, realistic.
You put yourself. I mean, we are children of the sun.
I'm not talking about the alt-right. I'm talking about European people in general. When I say something like that, in terms of the alt-right, I am well aware that we are a small, fledgling, heretical movement. Mm-hmm. I've never denied that.
What do you make of a statistic like half of the billion-dollar companies created in the United States are by immigrants, many of which are from not from Europe.
Not very many of which. I've actually looked. There was a report by Bloomberg about 5 years ago.
About half of which. Indian, Israeli were a big number there. I think it was at least half or more.
Okay. You have many white immigrants who are doing that. What you see right there is there is a cognitive elite from other races who will come to the United States.
Isn't that good for the United States that you're getting the best of the world coming here and producing jobs and companies?
They can produce great companies in their own homeland.
And then employ people not in America.
Do you think white people can't do these kinds of things? I mean, look. This is the thing that I think there is some good qualities about meritocracy where yes, you should allow people you should have a society where people can strive and so on. But that's not all of it. That's not what there has to be an identity. We want to protect white people.
Do I think white people cannot do these things? I actually think you think that because you want to get rid of the competition. You're afraid, apparently, of these people doing it and creating jobs. If white people can do it, then they can beat the competition here from anybody around the world.
Look, there are some advantages of a kind of IQ meritocratic immigration system where you are taking there's trillions of dollars of capital and money flowing around in the United States. You can have some smart Asian guy, smart Indian come and start a business. There are certain advantages to that, but identity is about the fact that look, we are not just meritocratic. We actually care about people. We want to have a society that is ours, and that those values actually do outweigh some liberal value of free global competition. So identity ultimately is more important than liberalism, than freedom.
So you think it is more important for the United States to prevent people coming over here, creating big companies, billion-dollar companies, create jobs. It's less important. That is less important than being in a conference with 275 people doing Nazi salutes or something like that.
Jamie, look, if mass immigration were only about a dozen Indians and Asians who come over here and create a company, I would probably not.
But you're against it, no matter what mass or not.
Yes, I would be against that. But I'm just saying that if the immigration question were only about 24 highly intelligent Indians who come here and create a company, I would not be that exercised about it. That would not be an existential threat to my people and our civilization. That's not what immigration is ultimately about. Immigration is about the mass movement of people. I mean, are those so-called Syrian refugees? Are they starting all these companies in Germany? Are they improving the economy? This is the fundamental aspect of what immigration is about. To just talk about a handful of people with 130 and plus IQs who start a company, it's a classic bait and switch.
But your view is that we can't assimilate people in this country.
You can assimilate small numbers of people
because you believe in identity. You can more than ideas.
Yes. Well, but ideas are coming from identity. But look, can you assimilate small groups of people? If all immigration were high IQ, 100 high IQ Asians who came here, could they assimilate? Could they become part of this culture? Sure. I recognize that. That's not what immigration is. Yeah. Immigration is the mass move. This is immigration in the 21st century are not a handful of individual families. Immigration is a mass movement of people, and it is like a war.
But you would admit that a lot of people back when Italians and Irish were coming, which you now consider white, were saying similar things. We can't assimilate these people. They're not white. They don't have our values, and so on.
Sure. And look, there were major ethnic divisions in the United States. One of the fundamental reasons why those have subsided are, of course, intermarriage between Europeans, but also the fact that we did have that big break between 1924 and 1965 where there was a formation of a nation.
I want to get to Twitter in a second.
Okay.
But I want to ask you one thing I read in the profile. You did a 23andMe, and it turned out that you had a small amount of African-American blood in you.
Yes. Yeah, I mentioned that. I mean, I'm happy to dox myself into 23andMe. I think it was 0.1% African or something like that.
But you could be in your own society with that, your own ethno-state.
Of course. That's a ridiculous question. What does that even mean? That could be certainly within the margure of error.
Well, there has to be a cutoff. There has to be a cutoff at some point. Right?
Well, that cutoff is not 0.1%.
Who's to decide?
That's look, I'm sorry. This is just a total logical fallacy. Who decides that? Therefore, we can't make a decision. No, that's ridiculous.
I'm just hoping you make the state. I'm on your side. I want them to let you in to your ideal society.
Already har.
Let's go to Twitter. You were suspended along with other white nationalists, identitarians, whatever you want to call them. You called it corporate Stalinism for purging you based on your views. Aren't they a private company? Don't they have every right to decide who participates?
This is a point where I think we need to rethink notions of free speech, and we need to rethink notions of public and private, because we are in a different world. When we think about censorship, when you hear that word, what images does that evoke in your mind? I would say it evokes the dictator twirling his mustache and pointing a gun at a journalist, or whiting out a headline in a newspaper. So that's the kind of censorship that we think. It's a very 20th century concept. Would you agree?
Of course, government censorship. That's what the
right.
First Amendment fights against.
Right.
But you're not a big believer in the Constitution, the First Amendment, so you more readily would.
It is interesting. I'll just point out that very early on in the Republic, government censorship was enacted in the Alien and Sedition Acts and so on.
Usually not looked fondly upon by most people today.
Right. Let's just put that aside. What I'm saying is that we need to start questioning a lot of these notions of government censorship and public and private. We need to start rethinking them. The fact is, Twitter has more power than most governments in terms of free speech. Twitter is it wants to be this. It wants to be a global platform, a global town hall for free speech. Twitter has more power than, say, the government, this state government saying that I can't publish something there. Twitter is the way that when there's something written about me in a paper, that I can respond directly to the journalist. Twitter was my way of interfacing with the world, even much more than my website, actually.
But, do you think a private business, for instance, should be allowed to restrict who goes there, black people?
Generally speaking, yes. I do believe that private businesses...
people created a company, Twitter, and if people don't want to go there anymore, they go to a different platform. What is wrong with that?
We need to rethink these things in the digital... we are in a digital world where there is a kind of all or nothing. You win, and you have all power in terms of creating these platforms for free speech.
Is Radix Journal open to anybody who wants to write for it? Or do you choose what ideas you want in there or not?
Again, I am telling you, I understand where you are coming from. I understand what you're talking about censorship. What I'm saying is that we need to start rethinking these things. Getting kicked off Facebook, getting kicked off Twitter. Imagine Google search is effectively ubiquitous. Could you imagine a situation where Google was restricting search results of, and they do this in terms of terrorist and some actually illegal copyright violations and so on. Could you imagine them restricting Google searches in terms of views? What I'm saying is we are in a new world in the 20th century. We need to recognize that, and we need to start thinking about things like this, that some of these private companies really have a public function. Google is a kind of public utility. So is Twitter. Do you want, say, Time Warner to start restricting IP addresses of people who are completely nonviolent, who are just expressing views? Is that a private company?
It is a private company. I understand that.
You have to understand what I am saying in terms of the importance and ubiquity of these digital platforms.
But if Twitter started restricting too many people would go to a different platform. Like, I think you said you were going to go to anyway a different platform.
I've gone to Gab. Look, Gab is great. I'm glad they created it. The fact is, I have been damaged by being kicked off Twitter. And the other thing, did I ever break the terms of service that I agreed to with Twitter? Not to my knowledge. I never threatened anyone with a physical attack. I would never do that. I was a polite member of that community. My final tweet, I went down fighting. I sarcastically addressed David Frum, and he actually responded to my tweet, indicating to me that he wanted to have a conversation. That's how I was using Twitter, and they systematically have suppressed me for my viewpoints, and not because I broke their terms of service.
Do you think it's appropriate that they threw off some other people who are more aggressive in their tweeting against people?
I simply won't support anyone who does any kind of real threat of violence. If someone says I am going to kill that, I can't support someone. But again, what I'm saying is that we've entered a new world in terms of digital media, and we need to start asking some questions that conservatives just aren't willing to ask. Conservatives are kind of private property fundamentalists, where we think, oh, Google can do anything, it's a private company. Google serves a public function. So does Twitter, so does Facebook, so does all sorts of things. The idea that these companies, it's fine if these companies just start suppressing free speech. It's not good. Most journalists who are in there, and journalists that I've talked to, do not want me banned from Twitter. Maybe that has something to do with the fact that it's, we don't want to make Richard a victim. The fact is, these journalists want to talk to me. My week last week was insane in terms of speaking with people. I spoke with Telemundo this morning. I'm speaking with you right now. I'm speaking with the New York Times later in the afternoon. Journalists want to interface with me. They do not want my views to be suppressed, and Twitter's doing that. That's bad for Twitter, and it's bad for the world, and I think it raises some very important questions about free speech in the digital age.
Let me close with this question here. You've committed yourself in a way, even with your own kind of long-term view, to kind of a life of isolation with your political views in a way, and probably failure, even if you were succeeding 1,000 years from now in terms of ethnostate. I think that won't succeed there. Do you ever think about that? Is that something that in any time you regret?
No, I don't regret my decisions at all. And I think it would be hard to classify me as a failure. We've already made a tremendous impact that can be measurable and that I don't think anyone would deny. In terms of bringing these ideas to the public square with such very little funding, breaking through into the mainstream. In terms of what I want to do,
I think the only unique idea that you brought to the public sphere is the ethnostate, and that is not necessarily.
I didn't invent the idea of the ethnostate, by the way.
Well, they didn't bring any. What is the unique idea
Jamie,
you brought to the public sphere?
What unique idea have you brought to the world?
I never said I did.
Okay. Look, we have had an impact. That is not failing. Secondly, look, there are people who.
How do you measure your impact? What is the impact?
That's a good question. To a degree, you can measure that simply by hits, but I think it's much more hits on a website. But I think it's much more than that. The fact that a presidential candidate has found it necessary to address us, that is Hillary Clinton. And by the way, Hillary Clinton did a great thing. I'm very proud. I'm very happy that she did that. I'm proud of her.
Do you think it was a political reasoning she did that? I mean, was there a political angle there? She wanted to tie you to Trump because she thought it would hurt Donald Trump.
Of course. I think there's actually even more to it than that. But the fact that we are being recognized, you have to break through. And even if we're being talked about negatively, we're being recognized. That is a higher level than we were 2 years ago. And so this is why I do interviews. This is why I talk to the press, even when they want to bash me.
Do you think the press does it to kind of build up you as a member of kind of the right and tie you to Donald Trump to show to try to prove that he's racist and things along those lines?
I think that is one of their motivations, yes. I think Hillary Clinton wants the alt-right to succeed because it makes it clearer for her. So who knows what the future for Hillary Clinton is? It's probably not very bright. But in August of this year, her strategy, I think, was to promote the alt-right so that the alt-right would become more of a thought leader, and that a lot of the cucks from the conservative movement, all of the neocons, effectively all of the neocons went over. I mean, Bill Kristol seems to be kind of playing some dance with Trump, but effectively all of the neocons voted for Hillary and went over to that side. I think she wanted to create a realignment. and she wanted to bring over a lot of suburban, college-educated, more upper-class white people to the Democratic Party. We'll see what happens. And I think she wanted the alt-right to rise as a way of kind of having a clearer division. I think, so yes, I think there is a strategy of a lot of the mainstream media that they want to promote the alt-right in order to smear Trump. Well, they should be careful about that. There are some unintended consequences to promoting these ideas. Some people might find them popular. Also, I think that there, a lot of, when I've done an NPR interview, there were all these people afterward that were saying, you're normalizing his views. Like, he's actually, they would say slick, but they kind of meant cogent and charming. And that is also a very positive thing in the sense that we have something to say. We have a place at the table. We can talk with people. I think we are getting to that point. It's slow, it's difficult, but we are getting to that point where the alt-right is going to have a place at the table. I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that conservatism is bankrupt. Conservatism, I don't see where conservatism is going. Conservatism doesn't really have anything new to bring to the world. Has Mike Pence ever said something that's made you rethink an issue? Like, are there really any great conservative intellectuals out there? The fact is, like, there is a vacuum due to the bankruptcy of mainstream conservatism, and the alt-right is filling it.
Let's go to the closing questions that I always do at the end of these.
Okay.
What historical figure do you most admire?
Interesting question. So is this a politician or a
leader? I usually say historical leader, but could be a figure, could be a philosopher.
Interesting. Let me just throw out a few. Shakespeare, Napoleon, and Nietzsche in the modern age.
What 3 books most shaped your worldview?
On the Genealogy of Morals certainly shattered me. Hamlet shattered me, made me rethink things. And more recently, Guillaume Fay has Why We Fight in Archaeofuturism. Their similar books have changed the way I look at the world.
Is there a writer, or are there writers that when you see their byline, you always read them?
Contemporary journalist?
Could be authors, could be fiction writers, nonfiction writers, journalists. But someone that when you see their byline, you always read them or name in a book.
There's this guy named Jamie Weinstein. No. Do you know one person? I'll just throw this out because this will. One person who I think always says something interesting, even when I profoundly disagree with him, is Slavoj Žižek.
I've seen him.
He's a leftist, but he actually came out saying that Trump was a really interesting thing. Yeah. So yeah, there are I could go through like dozens of journalists that I know and think are good, but yeah, let's throw that out there.
Who do you think is the most overrated person in politics?
I should have prepared for some of these questions. These are good. They're making me think. The most overrated person, like a politician.
Yeah. Could be a commentator.
I would say that the conservative movement, the kind of, from Fox News on down, if you want to just put that all into one person, from Bill O'Reilly to, I won't insult anyone here at the Daily Caller, but from Bill O'Reilly on down to conservative journalists, I think they are profoundly overrated. I think they believed that Americans were voting for Republicans because they believed in conservatism, and I think that they're slowly the realization is dawning in their mind that it was ultimately about identity, and I think they have a little too much respect for conservatism as an intellectual force. I don't have a tremendous amount of respect for conservative thought.
Thomas Jefferson famously, when he died, only wanted 3 things on his tombstone. You went to UVA, you probably heard this, that he was the founder of UVA.
Mm-hmm.
That
religious
he wrote,
liberty.
Right,
yeah.
Right. They wrote the Virginia Statutes on religious liberty and the Declaration of Independence. Many years from now, when you leave this mortal coil, what 3 things would you like on your tombstone?
Richard Spencer cared about his people and civilization, and Richard Spencer was willing to live dangerously in order to advance those things.
Richard, thank you for doing the show. I hope you don't mind me saying I wish you every failure in your quest in politics.
Yeah, likewise.
But I appreciate you coming in here.
Yes, I will second that, Jamie. However, I really did enjoy speaking with you.
Thank you. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The Jamie Weinstein Show. If you did, I would be forever grateful if you shared it with your friends and family. Most importantly, please, please, please subscribe to the podcast and leave a review of it on iTunes. If you want to see more of my work, check out jamieweinstein.com and follow me on Twitter at Jamie_Weinstein, where you can tweet me a question which I just might use in a future podcast interview. Thanks for listening.